The email arrived at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Not from her. From the courthouse. I was sitting in my office, the same office I'd built over 40 years. Mahogany desk facing the window, afternoon light cutting across the papers I wasn't really reading. The notification came through my phone first. Court filing received. Then the portal opened and there it was. Her name, my name, case number, and the word that made the room very quiet. Divorce, filed publicly. Filed without a conversation. Filed the way you'd file a tax return. Efficiently, without sentiment, without looking back. I remember staring at the screen for a long time. Not crying. Not angry yet. Just still. The kind of stillness that happens when your brain is trying to process something your heart already knew was coming, but refused to fully accept until it was printed in black courier on a government seal. Then the phone started. Not her calling to explain. Not a text saying, "I'm sorry, I should have told you first." Just the cascade. My brother-in-law, a colleague, someone from the gym. All of them saying some version of the same thing. I saw it online. "I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" That's when it hit me. I wasn't the first person to know my wife was divorcing me. Strangers were the first. The court database was faster than she was. And by the time the sun set that day, half the people I knew had seen it before I heard it from her mouth. She came home at 6:15 p.m. I was still in the office. I'd walked home without remembering the walk. "We need to talk," she said. Not as a question, as a statement of fact. As if the papers hadn't already done all the talking for her. But before I could respond, before I could ask her why I'd learned about the end of our marriage from an automated email, I had to rewind. Had to go back to the moment I thought I knew her. Had to remember when this wasn't inevitable. Had to ask myself, when exactly did I stop seeing what was happening? And that's where this story really begins. Not at the ending, but at the beginning of the end, the moment I was too trusting, too distracted. Too in love to notice that the woman sleeping beside me had already made her decision. The woman I'd given everything to had already decided to take it all. I have to start with the kitchen, because kitchens hold the most honest memories. It was a Saturday in the late autumn of 2019. She had just launched her consulting practice, her own brand, her own name on the letterhead, something she'd been talking about for years in that careful, almost apologetic way women of our generation sometimes speak when they want something that sounds ambitious but feels selfish to say aloud. I made her favorite soup. She came home at 7, tired, hair still wet from the shower, carrying a briefcase that looked too heavy for her shoulders. She set it down. She looked at me, not through me, not past me, but at me truly, and said, "You're the only one who never asked me to slow down." I believed her. I always believed her. For 43 years, I had been the architecture of our life, and she had been the light inside it. Not because she depended on me, she never did, not really, but because I loved her with a kind of loyalty that felt like architecture itself. I built the income. She built the style. I handled the quiet, long-term decisions, the investments, the estate planning, the maintenance of the house that had outlasted both of our parents. She handled the voice, the introductions, the way we were seen, and for a long time that balance felt like a gift. I never felt small in her presence. I felt chosen. She'd say things like, "You have the patience I don't," and I'd feel honored, not diminished. Our home was not extravagant, but it was dignified. Navy blue walls, bookshelves that held real books, not decorative spines, but volumes I'd actually read, sentences I'd underlined with a pen I'd owned since university. She had chosen every painting. Every piece of furniture had a story attached to it, usually hers. She was the curator of our life, and I was the quiet custodian who kept it running. I supported her from the beginning. When she said she needed to leave her old firm to build this practice, I didn't ask for a business plan. I said, "You have my name and you have my time." She smiled like I'd given her something sacred, and in a way I had. I was proud of her. Not because she needed my pride, she was already fierce, but because I loved watching her find her own center of gravity. But there were things I noticed, and things I chose not to notice. She started working late not just at the office, but at her laptop, at the kitchen island in the bedroom with the door closed. Not every night. Just enough to feel like a new rhythm. She spoke of scaling, of positioning, of legacy building. Language that sounded powerful to her, but that slowly made our private language feel like a business transaction in waiting. She began making decisions unilaterally, not maliciously, just efficiently. The trip to Aspen was canceled not because she was upset, but because it doesn't align with the brand narrative we're building. The renovation to the library was approved, then redirected, then approved again. Always with her vision, always with her authority. And when I asked quietly, not accusingly, whether she still felt the marriage the way I did, she'd put her hand in mine and say, "You are the only safe harbor I've ever had. I need you to trust that I'm building something that includes you." I did trust her. I trusted her with things I never told her about. Documents I kept in the study, not because I was secretive, but because I was organized. A folder of her business registrations, her tax filings, her early contracts, all kept with the care of a man who believed in his partner's success so completely that he documented it for her. She never knew about the folder. She never knew that I kept notes on her investment accounts, not to control her, but because I loved her, and a lover, I suppose, pays attention to what might be hidden from him. We were happy, if happiness can be defined by the surface of things. In 2021, we hosted a dinner for her new colleagues. I wore my navy blazer, the one she said made me look like a man who had nothing to prove, which was, I think, her highest compliment. She introduced me not with warmth, but with precision. "This is my husband. He's been the quiet foundation of everything I've done." The word quiet stayed in the air longer than it should have. Her colleagues smiled politely. One of them, a young woman with sharp glasses, asked me what my current interests were. I said, "My wife." That should have been enough, but later, after they left, she came into the study, this same study, the same desk where I now sit, and she said, "You're not going to believe how they see you. You're the husband of a rising law partner. You're supposed to be ambitious too, not angry, not cruel, just managerial." As if I were a project she was trying to help, I told her I was ambitious, but that my ambition had always been her. She smiled. She kissed my cheek. But she didn't close the door all the way. I should have asked what she meant by rising. I should have asked why she was collecting new people in our home and slowly allowing them to replace the old ones, our friends, our rituals, our quiet Saturdays. But I was too busy being grateful that she came home at all. In 2022, the shift became visible to anyone who was looking closely. She started taking calls in the other room, not because she was hiding them, but because the sound of her voice changed when she spoke to certain people. Calm, authoritative, strategic. She started using the phrase independent framework in conversation. Not about business, about us. "We need to establish an independent framework for our futures," she said one evening after dinner, as if she were proposing a renovation rather than dissolving a covenant. I said, "We have an independent framework. It's called 40 years. She looked at me with something that wasn't anger. It was assessment. That winter, she asked me to sign a document for her lawyer. Just a formality, she said. For the business restructuring, I signed it because I trusted her. Because she was my wife, and she had never given me reason to think of her as someone who could deceive me with paperwork. I kept a copy. I kept everything. And that is the life they think they're divorcing now. Not a broken marriage of neglect or cruelty, but a marriage of unequal weight, where she was always running toward a future she had already drawn, and I was always standing still, holding the ground she was about to leave. She never told me she had already made her list, not then, not when I was too busy loving her to ask the dangerous questions the last night, before the filing, before she stopped coming. Home with her briefcase and started coming. Home with her lawyer's number saved in her phone, I found. Something in her desk drawer, not a letter, not a confession. A single notebook, leather-bound, the kind she used for her strategic planning. On the first page, in her handwriting, a list, not of assets, of people she needed to inform first. I was not the first name. I put it back. I told myself, she's just organizing. She's just planning for a future she thinks I don't understand. But I should have seen the shape of it. I should have seen that she wasn't just leaving. She was constructing an exit. And I was still sitting here holding the door open, wondering why she wouldn't come back. It started with concern. That's the thing about manipulation. It never arrives wearing its true face. It comes wrapped in care. It comes as a question disguised as love. It was a Sunday morning in early spring of 2023. We were in the kitchen again, always the kitchen, where she felt most authoritative, and she was making her green smoothie. The one she'd started drinking after she read an article about longevity and optimizing your biological future. I was reading the paper, an actual paper, something she'd started to find quaint. "I've been thinking about us," she said. Not a question, a statement of intent. I lowered the paper. She was facing the blender, not me. "Okay," I said. "What about us?" "I think you're not happy." The words landed in a specific way. Not because they were true, but because they were framed as observation rather than accusation. She wasn't saying I'm unhappy. She was saying you are. The distinction mattered. It shifted the burden of proof onto me. "I'm very happy," I said. She turned the blender off. The silence that followed was deliberate. "You're not engaged with your own life," she continued. "You come home. You sit in the study. You read. You wait for me to come home. And I watch you do that and I think, that's not a life. That's a holding pattern." I set the paper down. She was still not looking at me directly. This was strategic. Eye contact would have made her vulnerable to my response. Without it, she was delivering a monologue. "I am engaged," I said. "I'm engaged with you. With us. That's the problem," she said. And now she did turn to me, and her expression was almost sad, as if she'd been carrying this realization for months, and was finally allowing herself to speak it. "You've made me your entire life, and I can't carry that. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me." There it was. The first pivot. Not "I don't love you, but I love you too much to let you waste yourself on me." Classic. Generous sounding. A cage dressed up as freedom. "I don't feel wasted," I said. "But you are," she said, and she sat down across from me. And I can still see the exact angle of the morning light on her face. The way she'd positioned herself so that the kitchen window was behind her, so that she was slightly backlit, almost haloed. "You're 68 years old. You have maybe 20 good years left. And you're spending them in a study waiting for me." The math was precise, calculated. She'd been thinking about my mortality. "I'm spending them with you," I said. "That was the choice I made 40 years ago. And I'm grateful for that," she said. And her voice softened in a way that made it worse, because it was genuine or sounded genuine, which amounts to the same thing when you're sitting across from someone you trust. "But I think you've outgrown this life. I think you need something more." "More than what?" "More than me." It was so perfectly constructed that I almost believed it. Almost thought that her desire to leave was actually an act of generosity. That she was freeing me from the burden of devotion. That the most loving thing she could do was leave. "I don't want more than you," I said. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was warm. Her grip was firm. "I think we need to have serious conversations about our future," she said. "Real conversations. Not about us, but about what we each need individually." And that was the hook. Not the hand-holding. Not the softness in her voice. But the reframing of our marriage as a negotiation between two independent parties rather than a partnership. Two people with separate needs. Two people who had to establish boundaries and frameworks. "What kind of conversations?" I asked. "Maybe with someone," she said. "A therapist. Someone who can help us both see clearly." I agreed. Of course I agreed. Because if she wanted help, I would get help. If she needed to understand why I loved her, I would sit in a room with a stranger and explain it. The therapist's office was on the second floor of a converted brownstone in the city. Soft lighting. Real plants. The kind of place designed to make you feel like your pain is being curated by someone with good taste. The therapist's name was Margaret. She was probably in her 50s, and she had the particular manner of someone who'd learned to nod at everything while maintaining absolute neutrality. She asked us both to describe the marriage. My wife went first. She spoke eloquently about codependency, about how my retirement had intensified the dynamic, about how she felt, responsible for my emotional well-being, about how she was drowning in the weight of being someone's whole world. It was a performance, but it was a brilliant one, because it was built on fragments of truth. I had been devoted. I was home more since retirement. I did wait for her, but the framing, the narrative she constructed, turned love into pathology. Then Margaret turned to me. How do you respond to what your wife has said? I told the truth. I said I loved her, that I had never felt like a burden to her, that I was happy, that I didn't understand where this was coming from. My wife shifted in her seat, barely perceptible, but I saw it. I think that's part of the problem, Margaret said carefully. You're not recognizing the impact you're having. The impact of what? I asked. Of loving someone? The impact of needing someone to fill a void in yourself. I hadn't said that. My wife hadn't said that explicitly. But somehow, Margaret had arrived at it, and now it was hanging in the room like a diagnosis. I don't have a void, I said. I have a wife. My wife looked at Margaret. A small glance. The kind of glance you give someone who understands you without words. That was when I realized this wasn't therapy. This was documentation. Every session, Margaret would ask me questions designed to elicit answers that proved I was dependent, lonely, living vicariously through my wife. And every session, my wife would nod sadly, as if she too was grieving the man I apparently was. By the fourth session, Margaret had written it all down. The narrative that I was a man who'd lost himself in his marriage, who needed to find independence, who was, in fact, preventing my wife from reaching her full potential. Have you thought about what you might do for yourself? Margaret asked me, in that particular tone that sounds like genuine curiosity but is actually a leading question. I have a life, I said. But what is it? Margaret pressed. What is it that's just for you? Not for your wife. Not for your marriage. For you. I thought about this, honestly, and I realized that the answer was nothing. My life had become her life. And somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that was enough. That was the moment my wife reached over and squeezed my hand. Not with affection, with confirmation. As if to say, see? You understand now. You see what you've become. After the sixth session, my wife came home and said she'd made a decision. I think we need to live separately for a while, she said. Not divorce. Not yet, just separation. Just space. Just a framework to establish independence. How long? I asked. Until we both know what we want, she said. I know what I want, I said. I want you. That's the problem, she said gently. And she almost sounded sorry. She moved into an apartment downtown in May. A one-bedroom, she said, just temporary. Just until she figured things out. I helped her move. I drove the boxes. I didn't ask what she was figuring out because I thought, and this is the part that haunts me now, I thought if I just waited long enough, if I was just patient enough, if I just gave her enough space, she would come back. She wouldn't need the space anymore. She would come home. I was already preparing the welcome. Home I would give her. What I didn't know was that she was already preparing the legal paperwork. What I didn't know was that every conversation we'd had in therapy, every word I'd spoken in vulnerability was being cataloged as evidence of my unsuitability, my emotional dependence, my inability to function independently. What I didn't know was that the woman who'd asked me to wait 40 years for her success was now waiting for the right moment to file the papers that would erase me from her future. And what I absolutely did not know was that while I was moving her boxes into that apartment, she was already meeting with her lawyer in a coffee shop 6 blocks away, discussing the strategy for taking everything I had built, not out of hatred, out of cold. Calculated planning dressed up as self-care. The lawyer's name was David Chen, and I never met him in person until much later, but I heard about him constantly. My wife would mention him in passing, the way you mention a trusted advisor. David says, became a refrain. David says the separation agreement should be formal. David says I need to protect my business interests. David says we should establish clear financial boundaries now, before things get complicated. I didn't understand at the time that David Chen was not giving advice. He was laying groundwork. It started with the bank accounts. In June, about 3 weeks after she'd moved into the apartment. She called me, not in person but over the phone, which should have been my first warning, and said she needed to restructure our finances for clarity. "What do you mean?" I asked. "We have joint accounts," she said. "David thinks we should separate them. For tax purposes, for liability purposes." "We've had joint accounts for 40 years, I said. "Exactly," she said. "And now we need to think about what happens if something happens to one of us. We need to be protected." The word protected hung there. Protected from what? From each other? "Okay," I said, because I was still operating under the assumption that this was temporary, that she was still my wife, that we were solving a problem together. "What does David recommend?" She sent me documents, 17 pages, legal language so dense that it might as well have been written in another language. The core of it was this: we would each open individual accounts. The joint accounts would remain, but they would be dormant. Our respective incomes would go into our respective accounts. "But we've always pooled everything," I said. "I know," she said. "But David says it's cleaner this way. For both of us, I should have called a lawyer of my own. Right then, I should have understood that the moment someone starts saying 'my lawyer says' instead of 'I think,' the conversation has already moved into a territory where love is no longer the currency. But I didn't. I signed the forms by August. It escalated. She came by the house, not to come home, but to pick up some things. She stayed for coffee. We sat in the kitchen, same table where she told me I wasn't engaged with my own life. "I need to talk to you about the house," she said. The house. The house we'd bought in 1989. The house where we'd raised our understanding of what a home could be. The house that held 40 years of decisions, compromises, memories, and, I would later discover, her long-term strategic planning. "What about it?" I asked. "David thinks we should get it appraised. For the separation agreement, appraisal. Not for insurance, for division. We're not dividing anything," I said. "We're separated. We're not divorced." "I know," she said, and her voice was patient, the way you speak to someone who is slowly understanding something obvious. "But we should know the numbers. Just in case, just in case. Code 4, just in case I decide to leave permanently and take half of what you built." I agreed to the appraisal. The appraiser came on a Tuesday. He walked through our home, measuring rooms, taking photos, making notes. I watched him document the life we'd built as if it were a commodity. The appraisal came back at $2.1 million. My wife called me that evening. "That's higher than I expected," she said. "It's a good house," I said. "It is," she agreed. "Which is why we need to be very clear about what each of us is entitled to." Entitled. Not deserving, not earned. Entitled. In September, she asked me to meet with her and David Chen. Not in his office. In a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. This too was strategic. Public enough that I wouldn't make a scene. Private enough that we could talk openly. David Chen was younger than I expected. Maybe 50. Expensive suit. The kind of lawyer who takes his time before speaking because he knows that silence makes people nervous. "Your wife wants to formalize the separation," he said, sliding a document across the table. "This is a preliminary separation agreement." I read the first page. Then the second. Then I stopped reading and looked at my wife. "This says you get the house," I said. 50% of the house," she corrected. "And you want me to buy out your half." "Eventually," David said. "Or you sell and we split the proceeds." "We haven't even discussed divorce," I said. "Not yet," David agreed. "But we want to establish the framework now. Before things get contentious, as if contentious were something that would happen to us rather than something being constructed by the man sitting across from me. "I need to think about this," I said. "Of course," David said, and he slid another document across the table. "This is a power of attorney form. Your wife is recommending that you both designate each other as POAs for healthcare and financial decisions. In case something happens, power of attorney. A document that would give her the legal right to make decisions about my finances, my healthcare, my assets, without my consent." "Why would we do that?" I asked. "Insurance," David said. "Mutual protection." I looked at my wife. She was looking at her coffee. "I don't think I'm comfortable with that," I said. That's fine, David said, and he gathered the documents. But I'd recommend thinking about it. It's actually very common in separating couples. Protects both parties. What it actually protected was her ability to access my financial information, to make moves, to control. I hired a lawyer of my own the next day. His name was Robert Walsh, and he was 73 years old, which meant he'd seen every manipulation in the book. She's building a case, he said, after I'd shown him the documents. Not for separation, for divorce. And she's trying to get you to agree to terms before you understand what you're agreeing to. But we haven't even talked about divorce, I said. Exactly, Robert said. She doesn't want to talk about it. She wants to present you with facts, and facts once established are very hard to change. He explained to me what I should have understood months earlier, that every document she was asking me to sign, every conversation with her lawyer, every neutral decision was actually a move on a chessboard that had been drawn months before. Did she tell you about the business restructuring? Robert asked. I went cold. What business restructuring? She filed paperwork 6 months ago, changing the structure of her consulting firm. Made it a separate LLC, moved assets into it, established it as hers alone. How do you know that? I asked. Because she had to file it publicly, Robert said. And because her lawyer is competent, which means he's probably advised her to move as much as possible into her name before the divorce is official. I thought about the document I'd signed. The one she'd asked me to sign for her business. I'd never read it carefully. I'd just signed it because she'd asked because I trusted her. We need to subpoena her financial records, Robert said. All of them, the firm, the personal accounts, everything. What Robert found over the next 2 months was systematic and methodical. She'd opened accounts I didn't know about, moved money into them, restructured her business so that it was entirely in her name, had conversations with her colleagues about protecting assets in case of personal changes, had even, and this is the part that still makes me feel naive, started a separate investment portfolio under her maiden name, which she'd legally reverted to 5 years prior, something she'd done quietly, without fanfare, probably while I was in the study reading. She hadn't just been planning to leave. She'd been planning to leave with as much as possible. The question is, Robert said, did she tell you any of this? I shook my head. Then it's fraud, he said simply. Marital fraud. She was hiding assets while maintaining the appearance of a joint marriage. But here's the thing about fraud. It's only fraud if you can prove intent. And intent is hard to prove when the person committing it is articulate, calm, and has a lawyer who knows exactly how to frame everything as prudent financial planning rather than deliberate deception. In October, she filed for divorce, not in person, not with a conversation, through her lawyer who sent Robert a letter. And that's when I finally understood. Every conversation we'd had, every document I'd signed, every moment of concern about my well-being, it was all surveillance. It was all reconnaissance. It was all part of a strategy to position herself advantageously before the real battle began. I had been so busy loving her that I hadn't noticed she was building a case against me. And the cruelest part? The thing that still haunts me? She'd done it all while maintaining the fiction that she cared about me, that she was concerned about my happiness, that she was trying to help me find myself. She was helping me find myself. All right, she was making sure that when I finally looked in the mirror, I was completely alone. The filing was public record. That's the part they don't really prepare you for. The fact that your marriage doesn't end in privacy. It ends on a government database. It ends in a court system that anyone with internet access can browse. It ends with strangers having the legal right to know the details of your most intimate failure. I learned about my own divorce from an automated email. It was a Tuesday. I was in the study, where else would I be? When the notification came through. Court filing received. The portal had updated. The case was assigned a number, and somewhere, in a law office downtown, David Chen was probably opening a bottle of something expensive, celebrating another successful strategic dismantling of a man who'd loved too well. I didn't call her. I didn't text. I sat very still and read the filing 3 times, as if the words might change meaning if I studied them long enough. They didn't. But what happened next was worse than the filing itself. By 3 p.m., my phone had started ringing. Not her. Never her. My brother-in-law. I just saw something online. Please tell me it's not true. A colleague from 30 years ago. I'm so sorry. Are you holding up? My accountant. We should talk about tax implications. A woman from my book club. I can't believe she'd do this to you. Each call was a small death. Each one meant that someone I knew, someone I'd had dinner with, someone I'd trusted with ordinary conversation, now had access to the fact of my abandonment. Not through me. Not through a conversation I'd chosen to have. But through a court filing which is public record, which means it's everyone's business. By evening, I'd turned the phone off. The house was very quiet. The kind of quiet that has a sound of its own. A high-pitched ringing that fills the spaces where conversation used to be. I made dinner. I sat at the table where we'd eaten together for 40 years. The place across from me was empty. It had been empty for months. But now it felt deliberately empty. Now it felt official. At 6:47 p.m., she came through the front door. Not with a key, she'd returned that months ago, but with the kind of authority that comes from knowing a home was half yours, which meant you could enter it whenever you wanted, for whatever reason you wanted. She was wearing her work clothes. Navy blazer? The kind of blazer that says, I have somewhere important to be after this. We need to talk, she said. I got the email, I said. I wanted to tell you, she said. And she almost sounded sorry. But my lawyer said it would be better if you heard it officially first. Better for whom? I didn't ask. I already knew the answer. Why didn't you tell me? I asked instead. I did, she said. In therapy. I told you we needed to have serious conversations about our future. You told me we needed therapy, I said. You didn't tell me you were filing for divorce. I was waiting for you to understand, she said. And her voice had that particular quality, that measured professional tone, that meant she'd rehearsed this conversation. Probably with David Chen, probably multiple times. I thought the separation would make it clear. I thought you would understand that this was coming. I thought you were working through something, I said. I thought we were in a separation because you needed space. I did need space, she said. Space from you. And I got it. And I realized I don't want to come back. The words themselves weren't shocking. But the way she said them, with such calm certainty, as if she were simply delivering a report on something that had already been decided, that was the moment something inside me broke. Not my heart. That had already been breaking for months. What broke was my faith in my own perception, the realization that I had been living in a narrative she'd written, playing a role in a story whose ending she'd already decided. When? I asked. When what? When did you decide? She looked away, at the kitchen window, at the garden she'd designed, at the life she was about to divide in half. A while, she said. How long is a while? Does it matter? Yes, I said. It matters to me. It matters whether you decided this last year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago or last year, she said quietly. I decided last year. When we'd taken that trip to Maine, when she'd said she loved me, when I'd thought we were rebuilding something, when I'd been planning our futures while she was planning our ending. Was there someone else? I asked. She didn't answer immediately, and in that hesitation I got my answer. It doesn't matter, she said finally. That's not why I'm leaving. Then why are you leaving? Because I'm tired, she said. And she finally looked at me and her eyes were tired but not sad. Tired the way you're tired of carrying something heavy. I'm tired of being your whole world. I'm tired of being responsible for your happiness. I'm tired of the weight of being loved like that. It was the narrative she'd constructed with Margaret the therapist. The story that my love was a burden, that my devotion was pathology, that I had somehow made myself into a parasite on her ambition. I never asked you to carry that, I said. You didn't have to ask, she said. You just did it. By being here, by waiting, by making me the center of your gravity. Because I love you, I said. I know, she said. And there was something almost pitying in her voice. That's the problem. She left an hour later. She took some papers from the desk, Documents related to the house, I think, though I didn't ask. She said she'd be in touch through her lawyer about the next steps. Through her lawyer, not through me. Not through conversation. Through David Chen, who was already probably drafting the next salvo. After she left, I walked through the house, not as if I was seeing it for the first time, but as if I was saying goodbye to it. The kitchen where she'd told me I wasn't engaged with my own life. The living room where we'd hosted parties and sat in silence and read separate books. The bedroom where I'd slept beside her for 43 years, and where, I realize now, she'd been awake planning, calculating, waiting for the moment when she could leave without guilt. Because she'd constructed a narrative where my love was the crime, I went to the study. I opened the desk drawer where I'd kept everything. The documents, the copies of her filings, the notes I'd taken on her accounts, the record of every move she'd made, laid out like evidence, and I understood for the first time that I had been collecting this not because I was paranoid, but because some part of me, some small, quiet part that I'd refused to listen to, had known all along that this was coming. I had known. And I had documented it anyway, and I had said nothing. Because I loved her too much to admit that she might not deserve to be loved like that. By the next morning, the news had spread further. My sister called from California. "Why didn't you tell me?" My oldest friend. "I saw it online. I'm so sorry." 3 people from the club I'd belonged to for 20 years. Sympathy, questions. The particular awkwardness of people who suddenly realize they have to choose sides. And underneath all of it, the shame. The feeling that I had failed somehow, that I had loved wrong, that I had been naive and pathetic and had deserved in some way to be left by someone who I thought loved me back. By noon, I'd stopped answering the phone. By evening, I'd stopped leaving the study. By night, I was sitting in the dark, in the chair where I'd spent 40 years of marriage, and I understood that the woman I'd given my life to had calculated every moment of our separation like a chess move. She hadn't left me out of passion or sudden revelation. She'd left me out of strategy. And the cruelest thing, the thing that would haunt me for months, was that she'd done it so carefully, so methodically, that by the time I understood what was happening, I was already positioned exactly where she needed me to be, alone, humiliated, doubting myself, holding all the evidence that she'd hidden from me, with no one to give it to because the moment I tried to use it, I would look like the bitter, scorned husband trying to take her down, which I realized was exactly the position she'd wanted me in all along. Robert Walsh called me on a Thursday morning in November. "We have a problem," he said. "Or rather, we have an opportunity." Depending on how you look at it, I was sitting in the study. I'd been sitting in the study for most of the past month. Not reading, not working. Just sitting watching the light move across the desk, the way it had moved across that same desk for 40 years. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked. "Her lawyer made a mistake," Robert said. "A small one, but a significant one." He explained that during the discovery process, the legal exchange of documents, David Chen's firm had sent over a batch of emails. Routine communication. But buried in those emails was a thread from 14 months prior. 14 months. Before the therapy. Before the separation. Before she told me she was concerned about my well-being. "Read this," Robert said, and he sent me the PDF. The email chain was between my wife and David Chen. The subject line was, "Strategic Positioning, Asset Protection." The first email, dated September of the previous year, was from my wife, David. "I need to restructure before things change. I'm planning significant personal shifts and want to ensure that my business remains entirely mine. Can you walk me through the steps? I want to be very careful about this. I'd rather he not know until it's necessary." Robert waited while I read it. Then he sent the next email, David's response, "Absolutely. First step is creating a separate LLC for the consulting firm, distinct from any joint marital assets. Once that's established, we can move strategic holdings into it. You'll want to establish separate banking, and I'd recommend setting up a trust in your maiden name. Gives you additional protection. The key is doing this before any marital complications arise. Once it's done, it's much harder to challenge. I'd suggest having a conversation about therapy or separation to establish narrative justification for financial independence. Then the legal structures will seem like natural consequences rather than premeditation. DC, I had to read that last paragraph 3 times. Have a conversation about therapy or separation to establish narrative justification for financial independence. He had told her to construct a narrative. He had told her to use therapy as cover. He had told her to make separation seem like a natural response to unresolved marital issues, when in fact, it was the cover story for asset protection. The next email from my wife was sent 2 days later. Perfect. I'll start with the therapist angle. I have someone in mind, someone who will understand what I'm doing. Then we move into the separation proposal. By the time he realizes what's happening, the structures will be in place. How long before it's airtight? David's response was immediate. 6 months minimum. 9 months is better. That gives us time to establish pattern and intent. By then, any challenge will look like him being paranoid or vindictive. I stopped reading. There's more, Robert said quietly. Keep going. The final email in the chain was from my wife, sent 3 weeks later, after she'd already signed me up for therapy. It's working perfectly. He has no idea. He's being so cooperative. The therapist is already framing everything as his fault, his codependency, his neediness. By the time I file, he'll be so emotionally destabilized that he won't even be able to mount an effective legal defense. He keeps saying he loves me. It's almost sad. I closed the laptop. James, Robert said. He'd moved to first names somewhere in the past month. This is gold. This proves premeditation. This proves fraud. This proves she strategically manipulated you using a therapist as accomplice. I didn't say anything. Do you understand what this means? Robert asked. It means she planned this, I said. All of it. The entire thing was planned. It means more than that, Robert said. It means that any settlement she tries to negotiate is built on fraud. It means we can challenge the entire separation agreement. It means we can go after her for damages. It means she never loved me, I interrupted. There was a long silence. James, Robert said carefully, I understand that you're processing something emotional here, but we need to focus on the legal implications. This changes everything about your case. We can win. We can win decisively. Win. The word hung there, strange and hollow. I didn't tell Robert what I did next. I went to the safe, the one she didn't know about, the one behind the panel in the study wall, and I took out the file I'd been keeping, the folder with her business registrations, her tax filings, her restructuring documents, the record of every move she'd made, starting from the month after she'd emailed David Chen about strategic positioning. I had documented her without knowing I was documenting her. I had kept every receipt, every filing, every piece of evidence, not to use against her, but because I was a man who kept records. It was who I was, organized, careful, thorough, and now without meaning to, I had built a case. I had all of it. The timeline, the communications, the financial movements, the therapy receipts showing sessions started exactly when David had recommended. The moment she'd opened the separate account, the day she'd filed the LLC paperwork, the email where she'd called my love almost sad. I could destroy her completely, utterly, in court. With lawyers, with judges, with the full weight of law on my side, I could prove that she had systematically deceived me. That she had used a therapist as a tool. That she had constructed an entire false narrative to justify abandoning me while protecting her assets. I could win. But something happened in that moment. Sitting in the study with the file open on my lap, I didn't want to win. I realized that if I used this, if I went to court with these emails, these documents, this evidence, I would become the bitter old man trying to destroy his ex-wife. I would confirm every narrative she'd constructed about my neediness, my inability to let go, my pathological attachment. And more than that, I would be fighting her game on her terms because the game wasn't about truth. It was about power. It was about control. It was about who could construct the most convincing narrative and convince a judge to believe it. And if I played that game, I would lose something more important than money or the house or vindication. I would lose myself. I would become the man she'd claimed I was, bitter, vindictive, unable to move forward, still defined by her, still fighting for her attention, still making her the center of my gravity, just in a different way. So I made a decision. I closed the file. I put it back in the safe, and I picked up the phone and called Robert. I want to settle, I said. What? Robert said. James, I want to settle, I repeated. Fairly, generously even. I want this to be over. You're not thinking clearly, Robert said. Give yourself time. Sleep on this. Tomorrow I'll want the same thing, I said. I want to let her go, and I want to keep the evidence locked away where it belongs. In the past. Where it can't hurt anyone else. James, she's going to take you for everything she can. Probably, I said. But at least I'll know it wasn't because I was weak. Will be because I chose to be merciful. There was a long pause. Is this about her? Robert asked finally. Are you still trying to protect her? No, I said. It's about me. I'm trying to protect myself from becoming the kind of man who would use someone's own words against them, even if those words prove she's a liar. After we hung up, I sat in the dark study for a long time. I had the power to destroy her. I had the evidence. I had the legal standing, and I chose not to use it. Not because she deserved mercy. She didn't. But because I deserved better than the man I would become if I did. The mediation was scheduled for December 15th, in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building downtown that probably cost more per square foot than most people's homes. I wore the navy blazer. The one she'd said made me look like a man who had nothing to prove. Robert had advised against it. Wear something that projects strength, he'd said. But I understood in a way I couldn't quite articulate that strength wasn't about projection anymore. It was about what you carried on the inside, invisible to everyone but yourself. My wife arrived 15 minutes late. She was wearing a charcoal suit that I'd never seen before, something sharp and architectural, designed to convey competence and distance. Her hair was different too, shorter, styled differently. She'd been reconstructing herself piece by piece, erasing the woman I'd known. David Chen was with her. Of course he was. He positioned himself slightly behind and to the left, the way a general positions himself on a battlefield, close enough to advise, far enough to observe. The mediator's name was Susan Whitmore. She was probably 60, with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent 30 years watching people negotiate the end of their partnerships. She'd seen every manipulation, every genuine regret, every moment where love turned into leverage. I've reviewed the documents, Susan said, laying out folders in front of us. I understand you're both interested in reaching a settlement agreement today. My client is interested in resolving this matter equitably, David said. His voice was smooth, practiced. We've prepared a settlement proposal. He slid a document across the table. I didn't open it. I was watching my wife. She was looking at her hands. Not out of shame, I realized, but out of focus. She was concentrating, present. This was a business transaction to her, and she was treating it as such. Perhaps we should start with what you're each willing to propose, Susan suggested. Robert looked at me. I nodded slightly. My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement, Robert said. He's willing to split the house value equally. He's willing to maintain spousal support for 5 years. He's willing to— We want more, David interrupted. Our proposal reflects the significant disparities in earning potential going forward. My client has an established consulting practice with substantial future income. Your client is retired. My client built the financial foundation that allowed your client to develop that practice, Robert said. Calmly, that's not relevant to current earning capacity, David said. Susan raised her hand slightly, a gesture that said, let me control this. Let's look at the numbers, she said. She opened David's proposal. Then she opened Robert's. She studied them both. There's a significant gap here. Your client is asking for nearly 60% of the marital assets, Mr. Chen. That's substantially higher than what your wife is entitled to under state law. My client's contributions are being undervalued, David said. She made significant sacrifices. What sacrifices? I said. It was the first thing I'd spoken since we'd sat down. My wife's head snapped up. She looked at me directly for the first time. I'm sorry? David said, as if I were a minor interruption. What sacrifices? I repeated. Her business was built on my income. The house was purchased with my money. The investments that funded her initial capital were my investments. What exactly did she sacrifice? Your client sacrificed her career trajectory to support the marriage, David said smoothly. There's a well-established body of research on the costs of marital compromise. She didn't sacrifice her career, I said. She pursued it aggressively. I supported it. Those are not the same thing. My wife's jaw tightened, just slightly. A micro-expression, but I saw it. Mr. James, Susan said gently. I understand you have feelings about this, but let's focus on the legal framework. The legal framework is built on a false premise, I said, and I opened the folder that Robert had prepared. The premise being that my wife's current financial position is the result of marital compromise, when in fact it's the result of systematic asset restructuring that occurred before she informed me of her intent to separate. I slid the emails across the table. David's face didn't change. That's how you know a lawyer is good. They don't show surprise. But I saw it anyway. A microsecond of recognition. The moment he understood that I had the emails, my wife reached for them. Her hand was steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulder. These are protected by attorney-client privilege, David said immediately. They were sent through unsecured company email, Robert said. They were discoverable. You made a procedural error, and we received them in the standard discovery batch. They're admissible. Susan picked up the emails. She read the first one, then the second. I watched her face as she read the line about having a conversation about therapy to establish narrative justification. Oh, she said quietly. These are out of context, David said. But his voice had changed, slightly less smooth, slightly more defensive. They're entirely in context, I said. They establish premeditation. They establish that my wife, with your guidance, structured a narrative designed to manipulate both me and a therapist into believing that the breakdown of our marriage was my fault, when in fact it was part of a strategic plan to restructure assets before a divorce filing. My wife's face had gone pale, not the pale of someone caught in a lie, but the pale of someone realizing that her strategy had a flaw, that she'd been documented, that the narrative she'd constructed so carefully had a counter-narrative, built from her own words. This is a serious accusation, Susan said carefully. It's not an accusation, I said. It's a fact, supported by email evidence, financial records, and a timeline that matches the recommendations David made to my wife about when to initiate therapy and when to propose separation. David was calculating. I could see it. He was running through the angles, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage, how to reframe this, how to maintain his client's position despite the evidence. Even if these emails are construed the way your client suggests, David said carefully, it doesn't change the fundamental legal analysis. Strategic financial planning during a marriage is not illegal. Asset protection is it is illegal, Robert said, when it's done in conjunction with fraud. When it's done with the specific intent to deceive a spouse about the state of the marriage while simultaneously hiding assets. That's marital fraud, and it changes the entire calculation. Susan set the emails down. She looked at my wife directly. Did you have conversations with Mr. Chen about structuring your finances in a way that your husband wasn't aware of? She asked. My wife didn't answer. She looked at David. My client declines to answer questions about her legal consultations, David said, which is essentially an admission, Susan said dryly, because if the answer were no, she'd say so. There was a long silence. Here's what I think is happening, Susan said, and she leaned back in her chair. I think your client strategically positioned herself financially while constructing a narrative designed to make her husband feel responsible for the marriage's breakdown. And I think she did this with legal guidance. which means that any settlement based on her current financial position is potentially fraudulent. David opened his mouth to object, which means, Susan continued, that you have a choice. You can continue down this path, and I can recommend that the judge see these emails and the timeline and make a determination about fraud. Or you can be realistic about what your client is entitled to. She turned to me. And your client needs to understand that even with this evidence, a judge might not rule entirely in his favor. He was married to her for 43 years. He supported her career. He's still going to owe her something, but it won't be 60%. It will be substantially less. What happened next was remarkable only in its quietness. David leaned over and whispered something to my wife. She closed her eyes, not in sadness but in calculation. She was reassessing. She was understanding for the first time that she might not win. That the narrative she'd constructed so carefully had a flaw. It was built on documented lies. We'd like a 15-minute recess, David said. Susan nodded. You have 20 minutes. After they left, I sat in the conference room with Robert, and we didn't talk. There was nothing to say. I had won. I had the evidence. I had the leverage. I could destroy her credibility in court. And David knew it. But winning didn't feel the way I thought it would. It felt like watching someone you loved realize, in real time, that you'd been paying attention all along. That you'd documented her deception. That love wasn't blindness. It was just patience, waiting for the moment when patience became evidence. When they came back, my wife's face was different. Not softer, just more honest. The mask had cracked slightly. We're prepared to accept a 50-50 split of marital assets, David said, with a 3-year spousal support arrangement, contingent on her income. It was a complete reversal. Exactly what Robert had proposed at the beginning. And we want the therapist records sealed, my wife said. Her voice was very quiet. Why? I asked. Because, she said, and she looked at me directly. Because I don't want people to know that I manipulated you using a mental health professional. Because I don't want it to be part of the public record. Because I want to preserve some dignity in this. She wanted dignity. After everything. After the strategic planning, the asset restructuring, the therapy manipulation, the public filing. She wanted dignity. And I understood in that moment that she was human. Flawed and calculating and cruel, but human. Someone who had made a choice to hurt me, and who was now facing the consequences of that choice. And who was asking for mercy at the last moment. We'll accept the seal, I said. Robert looked at me like I was insane. James, he started. We'll accept it, I repeated. She's right. There's no benefit to anyone in this being public. It took another hour to finalize the details. But it was done. The marriage was divided into assets and liabilities and percentages, and she walked out of that conference room with exactly what she'd been entitled to all along. Not more. Not less. Just what was fair. And I walked out knowing that I'd had the power to take more, to humiliate her, to make her pay for her deception. And I'd chosen not to, not because I was kind, but because I was dignified. The final decree was signed on January 9th. There was no ceremony, no moment of closure. Clerk stamped a document, and 43 years of marriage became an entry in a database. The same database that had told the world about it before it told me. I expected to feel something dramatic. Relief, maybe, or grief arriving all at once, the way it does in films. Instead, I felt the particular emptiness of a room after the furniture has been removed. The shape of what was there remains, drawn in dust and pale rectangles on the wall, but the thing itself is gone. The reversal, when it came, didn't come from me. That's the part I want to be clear about. I never sent a single email, never made a phone call, never spoke a word against her to anyone who might repeat it. When people asked, and they ask constantly in that hungry, sympathetic way people ask about other people's disasters, I said the same thing every time. It didn't work. That's all. Sometimes things don't work, 14 words. I must have said them 200 times that winter. But here's what I learned about the truth. It doesn't need a spokesman. It has its own gravity. It moves through a community the way water moves through soil. invisibly, patiently, finding every channel, until one day the ground shifts. David Chen's firm had made a procedural error. That error had been documented in the discovery record, and discovery records in a contested matter are reviewed by more than just the parties involved. Susan Whitmore, as mediator, had a professional obligation to note irregularities. She noted them. I didn't ask what happened next. I genuinely didn't. But I heard eventually the way one hears about weather in another county. There was a review, not a public one. Nothing that made a newspaper, but the kind of quiet internal inquiry that law firms conduct when a partner has advised a client to construct a false narrative involving a licensed mental health professional. David Chen left the firm in April. The announcement said he was pursuing independent opportunities. Margaret, the therapist, was contacted by her licensing board. Again, quietly. Again, nothing public. I never learned the outcome, and I made a deliberate decision not to look. She had done something wrong, but she had also, I suspect, been used. There is a difference between a conspirator and a tool, and I no longer had the appetite to determine which she'd been. As for my wife, my former wife, the shift in her world was slower and more subtle. Her consulting practice depended on a specific reputation. Integrity, judgment, discretion, those are not qualities you advertise. They're qualities other people confirm about you when you're not in the room. I don't know exactly what was said, or by whom. Susan Whitmore was a professional. She wouldn't have gossiped. Robert Walsh was 73 and had no interest in anything but his golf handicap. But mediators talk to lawyers, and lawyers talk to clients, and clients sit on boards, and boards make decisions about who they retain. 2 of her larger contracts were not renewed that spring, and I learned this from my accountant, of all people, who mentioned it in passing while reviewing my revised financial position. Her firm lost the municipal account, he said. Odd. They'd had it 6 years. I said nothing. He looked at me over his glasses. You don't seem surprised. I'm not glad, I said. And it was true. I wasn't. In May, something happened that I still think about. I was at the hardware store, a genuinely mundane errand, replacing a bathroom fixture, when I ran into Thomas Reeve, a man who had sat on the board of her largest client for a decade. We'd met perhaps 6 times over the years, always at her functions, always briefly. He stopped me in the aisle. I owe you an apology, he said. I didn't understand. For what? For what I thought about you, he said. For 4 years I was told a story. About a man who couldn't let go. Who was holding someone back. He paused. I believed it. I repeated it once or twice. Then I saw the actual record. I stood there holding a chrome faucet, uncertain what to do with any of this. You never defended yourself, he said. Not once. Not to anyone. There wasn't anything to defend, I said. The truth was already true. It didn't need my help. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he shook my hand, firmly, formally, the way men of my generation shake hands when they mean it. That's the most impressive thing I've heard anyone say in a very long time, he said, and he walked away. I want to be honest about something, because this story is worthless if I'm not. There was a night in February, a bad night, the kind where the house is too quiet and the mind is too loud. When I sat in the study with the safe open and the file in my lap, and I thought about sending it, all of it, to everyone. Her colleagues, her clients, her sister, the professional associations, the local business journal. I composed the email. I actually composed it, attachments and all. I sat with my finger over the trackpad for what must have been 20 minutes, and then I closed the laptop, and I put the file back in the safe. And I turned the dial, because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't fully understood before. The evidence had already done its work, not by being broadcast, but by being true, by existing, by having been shown once in a quiet room. To the 3 people who needed to see it, everything after that was just gravity. If I had sent that email, I would have taken the outcome away from the truth and claimed it for myself. And then it would have been my act, not her consequence. It would have been revenge, and revenge is a debt that never finishes collecting. By summer, my life had a shape again, not the shape it had before. A different one. Smaller in some ways, larger in others. I sold the house, not out of bitterness, but because 2,000 square feet is an absurd amount of room for one man and his books. I bought something modest with good light and a garden I could manage myself. Robert Walsh retired in June. At his party, he pulled me aside. 41 years of practice, he said. You're the only client I ever had who could have won more and chose not to. I did win, I said. He looked at me. Yeah, he said finally. I suppose you did. The last thing I'll say about the reversal is this. She called me once. August. Late, close to 11 at night. I'm not going to apologize, she said. I don't think I'd mean it, and you'd know. All right, I said. A long silence on the line. You had all of it, she said. The whole time. Everything I did. And you never used it. I used it once, I said. In a room with a mediator. That was enough. Why? I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I wasn't trying to beat you, I said. I was just trying to stop being lied about. She was quiet for a long time. That's worse, you know, she said finally. That's so much worse than if you'd hated me. And then she hung up. I sat in the dark for a while afterward. In a new house, in a chair that had no history in it. And for the first time since that Tuesday in October, I slept through the night. A man learns the truth about himself very slowly, not all at once like a light switching on, but gradually, in pieces, the way dawn actually works. Not a sudden brightness, but a slow clarification of what was always there, just hidden in shadow. I am 72 now. The divorce was finalized 18 months ago. Still live in the house I bought after the settlement, in a neighborhood I didn't know before, surrounded by people who don't know the story. That is a gift I gave myself, this anonymity, this chance to be unknown and therefore new. The first thing I learned, in the months after it was over, was that I had been keeping records not out of paranoia, but out of love. This is a difficult thing to admit, but it's true. A man who truly loves someone doesn't keep a file of their deceptions. A man who loves someone accepts what they tell him and believes it and moves forward. But a man who suspects he's being lied to, even if he refuses to consciously acknowledge that suspicion, a man like that keeps documentation. I had known, somewhere in a part of my mind I wouldn't fully access, I had known that something was wrong. And instead of confronting it, instead of asking the hard questions, I had simply documented it, quietly, without admission, without having to face the thing I suspected. That makes me complicit in my own betrayal. Not equally responsible, but complicit. I saw the signs and chose to ignore them. And then I built a file instead of having a conversation. That's the kind of thing you spend a lot of time with, in a quiet house with only your own company. The second thing I learned was about the nature of love itself. I loved her well, I think. I was loyal and present and attentive. I built a financial foundation that allowed her to pursue ambitions she wouldn't otherwise have pursued. I supported her publicly and privately. I was, by any reasonable standard, a good husband. And none of that was enough. Not because I failed in the doing of it, but because I failed in the seeing of it. I never asked whether she wanted to be loved that way. I never asked whether the kind of devotion I offered was a gift or a burden. I simply offered it, and when she told me it was too much, I believed her explanation rather than examining my own choice, because that's what I had done. I had chosen to love her that way, not because she demanded it, but because I needed to. Because loving her completely, devotedly, without reservation, that was the story I told myself about who I was. A man capable of great love. A man defined by his loyalty. But here's what I understand now. That story was about me, not about her. I was in love with the idea of being the kind of man who could love like that. And when she no longer fit the role I'd written for her, the role of woman worthy of that love, instead of revising my understanding of her, I should have revised my understanding of myself. I should have asked, what does it mean that I need to be needed this completely? What does it mean that my entire sense of self is built on someone else's acceptance of my devotion? Those are not questions about her. They are questions about me, and I spent 43 years not asking them. The third thing I learned was about documentation itself. I kept those files, and they saved me legally. They proved her deception. They protected my interests. They demonstrated that I was the victim of fraud, but they also turned me into someone I didn't want to be. A man who notices everything, a man who documents, a man who loves with one part of himself while the other part keeps score. After the settlement was finalized, I had a choice about those files. I could have stored them safely, kept them as insurance, maintained them as proof of something I survived. Instead, I burned them. Not performatively, not as some grand gesture. I simply took them to a fireplace on a cold morning in March, and I watched them burn. And I didn't feel like I was destroying evidence. I felt like I was forgiving myself for having needed the evidence in the first place. Because the truth is, if you keep documentation of someone's deception, you're still letting them live in your head. You're still letting them occupy space in your present. You're still making them the defining narrative of your life. Here's what happened next. And I'll try to be precise about this because precision matters. After the papers burned, I stopped thinking about her constantly, not immediately. For weeks after, I'd still catch myself constructing conversations I should have had, arguments I should have made, truths I should have said. But gradually the frequency decreased. And then one day, I can't pin down exactly when, I realized I'd gone an entire afternoon without thinking about her at all. And the next day, I did the same. And eventually, she became what she should have been all along, a person who existed in my past but not in my present. Not a villain, not even really a victim because she'd made her choices, just a woman I'd loved who had hurt me, and who I'd chosen to forgive, not because she deserved it, but because I deserved the peace of not carrying her with me anymore. I have spent a great deal of time, in these past months, thinking about what I would say to myself if I could go back to 1980, to the beginning, knowing what I know now, and the answer is strange, because I wouldn't tell myself not to love her. I wouldn't tell myself to protect myself more, or trust her less, or keep better boundaries. I would tell myself something different. I would say, you're going to love this woman, and it's going to be real, and it's going to be beautiful, and it's also going to be the thing that blinds you. And that blindness is not a failure of character. It's just what happens when you love someone more than you love yourself. But here's the thing, you have to love yourself too. Not more, just as much. Not as an afterthought, but as a foundational principle. You have to be willing to say, when the time comes, I love you. And I also love myself enough to not accept this treatment. You have to understand that devotion is not the same as dignity, and that you can have both. You will not do this. You will choose her over yourself so many times that it will become invisible to you, just the way you are. And I can't stop that. I can only tell you that when it finally breaks, when she finally leaves, that moment will be painful. But it will also be an opportunity. It will be an opportunity to learn who you are when you're not, defined by someone else's acceptance of your love. Take it. The man I am now is not the man I was. I am 72, and I live alone, and I have less money than I did. And I have fewer people in my life who I see regularly. By many measures, my life is smaller, but it is mine. Entirely mine. And there is a profound peace in that. A kind of clarity that I didn't have when I was always managing someone else's narrative, trying to make myself acceptable to someone who had already decided I wasn't. I have friends now, real friends, not people we knew as a couple. I read voraciously, without anyone implying that it's a waste of my time. I have started to paint, something I haven't done since university, and I'm terrible at it. And it doesn't matter because there's no one to be terrible for. I paint for myself. I have learned to be alone without being lonely, and I have learned to sit with the complicated truth that I was wronged. And I was also naive, and both of those things are true, and neither one makes me less of a man. Last month I saw her. Not by design. I was at a grocery store, in the produce section, and she came around the corner, and for a moment we stood there with the tomatoes between us. She looked older, or maybe just tired. Her face had that particular exhaustion of someone who's still running, still climbing, still trying to build something that will finally be enough. Hello, she said. Hello, I said. We stood there for maybe 5 seconds, long enough for me to see that she was waiting for something. Anger maybe, or bitterness. or the kind of plea I might have made if I hadn't burned the files and forgiven myself. Instead, I smiled. Not a broad smile, a small one, the kind you give someone you used to know. "I hope you're well," I said. Something flickered in her face. It might have been disappointment that I was not still fighting for her. Or it might have been relief. She moved past me without answering, and I finished selecting my tomatoes, and we left that moment in the produce section, where it belonged. If I have learned one true thing from all of this, it is this: the moment someone stops defining you is the moment you finally become yourself. For 43 years, I defined myself in relation to her, as her supporter, her foundation, her loyal partner. And that was real and it mattered. But it wasn't the whole story of who I was. It was just the story I was most comfortable telling. Now I get to tell different stories. Stories where I am the protagonist, not the supporting character. Stories where my choices matter because they're my choices, not because they serve someone else's narrative. I will not recover from this. I don't believe in recovery from something like this. Recovery implies returning to a previous state, and I don't want to go back. What I will do is move forward, slowly, carefully, with the particular dignity of a man who loved too much, and who learned too late to love himself. And the final truth, the one I save for the absolute end, because it's the most dangerous, is this: she was wrong about one thing. She said I made her the center of my gravity, that I couldn't let her go, that my love was a burden she couldn't carry. But the truth is, I let her go the moment I understood that holding on would require me to become someone I didn't want to be. I chose her for 43 years, and then I chose myself for the rest of my life. And that choice, that single act of choosing myself, of burning the files, of forgiving not her but myself, that choice was the most powerful thing I've ever done. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone will applaud, but it was mine. And sometimes that's all dignity really is, the quiet choice to be yourself, even when it means standing alone. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner.